Big Shaq sees the black construction worker gently feeding his blind daughter. A moment that seems simple, but shakes something deep inside. Behind that quiet act lies a truth, a pain, and a history that can no longer stay hidden. The rough hands, the silent trust, and Big Shaq's unspoken choice. It's not just an encounter, it's the beginning of a reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling construction site bordering downtown, its concrete skeleton stretching toward the clear blue sky. Big Shaq, towering and effortlessly charismatic in his tailored jacket and dark sunglasses, had arrived for a routine site check on one of his latest investment properties. His schedule was tight, meetings back to back, but something pulled at his attention. A movement caught his eye, a pause in the rhythmic clang of steel and hum of machinery. Near the site's edge, where a rough makeshift lunch area had been cordoned off with caution tape and scattered crates, a lone construction worker stood, his silhouette framed against the harsh afternoon light. Samuel was his name, though Shaq didn't know it yet. A black man, his dark skin glistening with sweat, his broad shoulders stooped slightly. He moved with a deliberate gentleness. In his hands, a spoon hovered between a small plastic container and the lips of a child. His daughter, Shaq realized. She was seated on a folded camp chair, her tiny hands fumbling in the air, her head tilting toward her father's voice, but never quite focusing. Alana. Shaq's steps slowed, his phone forgotten in his hand, as he observed the scene. The girl's eyes were clouded with blindness, her pale gaze fixed just beyond her father's face. Samuel spoke softly to her, his words inaudible over the site's din, but his tone carried across the dusty expanse, a cadence of comfort, of routine, of something heartbreakingly familiar. Behind them, a group of laborers snickered under their breath, watching the scene with a mix of mockery and discomfort. The foreman, a red-faced man with a clipboard and a perpetual scowl, barked out an order loud enough for Shaq to hear. "Hey, Samuel, we're on the clock, not babysitting time. Move it." Shaq's jaw tightened. There was a sharpness to the foreman's tone, something that prickled under his skin. He'd heard that tone before in boardrooms, in whispered comments after interviews, in dismissive laughs behind closed doors. The tone of someone who thought power gave them the right to diminish others. But it wasn't just the foreman's voice, or the jeering laughter of the workers, that unsettled him. It was Samuel's reaction. The man flinched, not with anger, but with something deeper. Shame, perhaps. Or fear. His shoulders hunched lower, and for a fleeting moment, his hand trembled as he guided the spoon to his daughter's mouth. Alana accepted it with a small instinctive nod, her face serene in a way that made Shaq's heart clench unexpectedly. Shaq shifted his stance, stepping closer, though he kept his presence discreet. He wasn't sure why, but something about this man's quiet dignity, the vulnerability in his posture, and the child's trusting stillness, felt like a story too easily dismissed, too easily buried beneath the noise of ambition and construction dust. A worker nearby caught sight of Shaq and gave a nudge to his buddy, murmuring something that earned a nervous laugh. The foreman, noticing the distraction, turned to offer Shaq a wide, insincere grin. "Mr. O'Neill. Didn't see you there, sir. Everything's under control here." Shaq nodded, but his gaze didn't shift from Samuel. "I noticed," he said evenly. "Looks like a man feeding his kid. That a problem?" The foreman's face flushed darker, his grin faltering. "It's just, safety protocols, productivity. We can't have what?" Shaq's voice was smooth, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. A father caring for his daughter on his lunch break. Or is it something else? The foreman stammered, but Shaq didn't wait for an answer. His gaze locked onto Samuel's, offering the man a silent nod of acknowledgement. The construction worker, caught between gratitude and guardedness, gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod in return. As Shaq turned back toward his waiting SUV, he couldn't shake the image of Samuel's hands. Rough, calloused, steady despite the jeers and the orders. He couldn't shake Alana's blind, trusting face, her small smile as her father fed her with a care that spoke of routines carved from resilience. Back inside his vehicle, the cool air felt almost alien against his skin. He leaned back against the leather seat, closing his eyes briefly. His assistant chattered about the next meeting, about investment updates. But Shaq wasn't listening. His mind was replaying the scene. Samuel's silence, the tension in his shoulders, the way the other workers had recoiled from him as though proximity to his struggle was contagious. And underneath it all, Shaq felt a pull. He'd built his empire on calculated risks and sharp instincts. This wasn't about investments or profit margins. It was something rawer, something that whispered of injustice hidden in plain sight, of stories that powerful men like him were conditioned to overlook. "Cancel the next meeting," Shaq said quietly. His assistant blinked in surprise. "Sir? You heard me. I've got something more important to look into." As the SUV pulled away from the site, Shaq glanced once more at the distant figure of Samuel, still feeding Alana, still standing beneath the merciless sun. There was more to this man, more to his story, and Shaq, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, was determined to uncover it. The city skyline blurred past the windows, but the image of a father and daughter, framed by scaffolding and shadows, burned clear and sharp in Shaq's mind. It wasn't just an encounter. It was the beginning of something that would unravel everything he thought he knew. In the days that followed, Big Shaq found himself restless, unable to shake the image of Samuel and Alana from his mind. The construction site had resumed its noisy symphony of drills and hammering, but for Shaq, the air around it buzzed with a different kind of electricity. It wasn't just about a father and daughter caught in a moment of vulnerability. It was something deeper, something hidden. The way Samuel had fed Alana, the subtle tremor in his hands, the wary way he'd glanced at the other workers. It all hinted at an untold story, waiting to be unraveled. Shaq returned to the site under the guise of checking on his investment. But his real focus was on Samuel. He watched him from a distance, noting his posture, straight, disciplined, almost too precise for a man supposedly relegated to manual labor. Samuel moved through his tasks with an efficiency that seemed practiced, calculated, as though every movement was measured not just for productivity but for invisibility. He avoided eye contact, kept his head down, and never lingered near the other workers. Shaq's gut told him this wasn't just a case of a man keeping to himself. There was an undercurrent, a silent tension that crackled like static in the air. He noticed how the foreman's tone shifted whenever Samuel was around. Sharp, dismissive, but also tinged with something else. Fear. No, it was more complex. Unease. One afternoon, Shaq approached the site with an air of casual authority. Stepping into the midst of the break area where the workers gathered over greasy takeout and quick smokes, conversations faltered as he entered, eyes shifting toward him and then away. He spotted Samuel alone at the far end, seated on a crate, quietly fixing a snapped line of cable. Alana wasn't with him today. Shaq turned to one of the younger workers, a lanky man with a nervous laugh who'd been the loudest among the jeering crowd days ago. "What's the story with Samuel?" he asked, keeping his tone light but firm. The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if to ensure no one else was listening. "He keeps to himself," he said after a pause. "Always has. We don't ask questions." Shaq raised a brow. "Why not?" The worker shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, man, some of us heard things about his past. Not worth getting mixed up in, you know? Bad stuff. People who don't take kindly to questions." Shaq's curiosity flared. "Like what?" The worker hesitated, then leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Alana's accident. It wasn't no accident. People say someone meant for it to happen. Samuel used to work in places where he shouldn't have. Places where loyalty was life or death. Then he disappeared. Showed up here with the kid blind as a bat. And nobody asks why. It's safer that way." Shaq felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Alana's blindness, so gentle, so unquestioning, wasn't just a twist of fate. It was a consequence. And Samuel's silence, his rigid movements, his instinct to protect her. It was the armor of a man carrying more than just personal guilt. Determined to learn more, Shaq made discreet calls over the next few days. His network was vast. Agents, attorneys, old friends from his playing days who owed him favors. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle emerged. Samuel had once been employed as a high-level logistics consultant for a notorious company in the port districts, a company known for shady dealings and a tendency to make problems disappear. One night, there had been a mishap at the docks, an explosion that left no trace but rumors. A child had been there. A child who shouldn't have been anywhere near such danger. Alana. Shaq's breath caught as the realization solidified. This wasn't just a case of a laborer with a sick child. This was a man running from a past that refused to let him go. Samuel's avoidance of eye contact wasn't just humility. And the workers' hesitation to speak wasn't out of pity, but because they knew something darker lingered behind his quiet presence. The next day, Shaq arrived at the site early, catching Samuel alone, near the scaffolding. He approached with deliberate steps, his shadow long in the morning sun. Samuel stiffened as Shaq drew near, his hands halting mid-motion. "You're not just a guy swinging a hammer, are you?" Shaq said softly, his tone low but firm. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting sideways. "I don't know what you mean." Shaq held his gaze. "Alana's blindness. That wasn't an accident. I know what you're running from. I know why you're hiding. And I'm not here to judge you. But you can't outrun the past forever." Samuel's shoulders sagged, a quiet exhale escaping him. His voice was barely a whisper. "They'll come for me if I talk. They'll come for her. She's all I have left." Shaq felt the weight of the confession settle between them like a dense fog. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was far from complete. Samuel's silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. And Alana's presence, her gentle blindness, wasn't just a tragedy, it was a living reminder of a past that had scarred them both. As Shaq left the site that day, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Samuel wasn't a man who needed pity. He was a man who needed protection, and Shaq, for reasons he couldn't quite explain yet, was determined to be the one to provide it. There was a deeper game at play, one layered with secrets and quiet threats, and Shaq could feel it pressing in from the edges. The whispers weren't just beneath the surface, they were rising. Louder, insistent, and ready to drag them all under if he didn't act. His mind had been restless since his conversation with Samuel. Puzzles missing pieces, whispers that refused to settle. He had come early, hoping to catch a glimpse of Samuel before the day's chaos erupted, but Samuel was nowhere in sight. Instead, a cluttered workbench caught Shaq's eye, where a worn leather-bound folder had been hastily shoved beneath a pile of scrap paper and blueprints. It was the kind of mistake a man like Samuel wouldn't make unless he was distracted or desperate. Shaq glanced around, his pulse quickening, before pulling the folder free. His large hands trembled ever so slightly as he flipped it open. The contents were a jumbled mess. Architectural blueprints marked with red X's, internal safety reports flagged with notations of structural risk, and at the bottom, a set of legal documents. These weren't ordinary work orders or site permits. They were tied to an incident, a collapse of an old warehouse in the Port District, its memory buried under layers of paperwork and legalese. Shaq's breath caught as he recognized the dates and locations. This was no ordinary accident. The collapse had been a major story, briefly surfacing before being buried by corporate spin. Injuries were downplayed, and one fatality, a child, had been attributed to misadventure. But the documents in front of him told a different story. Alana. Her name wasn't on the papers, but the echoes of her injury, her blindness, reverberated through every word on the page. The collapse hadn't been an accident. It was a consequence of ignored safety warnings, falsified inspections, and the ruthless ambition of a name Shaq knew all too well. Richard Collier, a real estate tycoon known for his flashy developments, and even flashier reputation. Collier's empire sprawled across the city, his name etched into glass towers and high-rise condos. But behind the glitz was a man willing to bury any obstacle, including human lives, to protect his investments. The papers revealed an insidious truth. Collier's company had falsified safety inspections to cut corners, risking collapse to meet deadlines and inflate profits. When the inevitable happened and the warehouse crumbled, a quiet cover-up ensued. Payouts were issued to silence victims, signatures forged to absolve blame. And there, scrawled in hurried ink, on one document's lower margin, was Samuel's name. Or rather, his forged signature, used to rubber stamp a fake clearance report. Shaq's heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't just negligence, it was calculated greed, with Samuel and Alana as collateral. But as his eyes scanned the document further, a chill slid down his spine. Among the list of subsidiaries tied to the project was a familiar name, Henderson Holdings, his own company's branch, a name he'd trusted, assuming due diligence and ethical conduct. Now that trust was unraveling. He closed the folder slowly, his thoughts colliding like freight trains. This wasn't just Samuel's fight, it was his too. His signature, his company's silent complicity, had indirectly contributed to the chain of events that blinded Alana and forced Samuel into a life of fear. His hands tightened into fists, not out of anger at Samuel, but at himself. How many times had he signed off on documents without scrutinizing the fine print? How often had he trusted assurances from polished executives without questioning the human cost? As the construction site came to life, voices rising and machinery humming, Shaq tucked the folder beneath his arm. He wasn't leaving it for someone else to stumble upon. Samuel's secret was now his burden too. He made his way toward the site's edge, where a temporary office trailer stood. He needed privacy, a space to think. Inside, he spread the documents across a folding table, piecing together the puzzle. The deeper he delved, the more he realized how calculated the deception had been. There were internal memos discussing cost overruns and the need to fast-track safety clearances. Collier's name appeared repeatedly, his directives written in cold corporate jargon that masked the lethal reality. Shaq's mind raced. This wasn't just about Alana, it was about systemic corruption, a pattern of reckless endangerment hidden behind the gloss of real estate deals and charitable press conferences. If he exposed this, it wouldn't just topple Collier, it might implicate Shaq himself, his company, his legacy. But the thought of walking away was impossible. The image of Alana's sightless eyes, her quiet trust in her father's care, haunted him. He couldn't let her be another casualty of a system that valued profit over people. A soft knock at the trailer door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Samuel standing there, his face pale and strained. His eyes flicked to the folder spread across the table, then locked onto Shaq. "I see you found it," Samuel said quietly, his voice rough with resignation. Shaq nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because men like Collier don't just ruin careers," Samuel replied, stepping inside and closing the door. "They ruin lives. They bury you, and they bury your family. Alana, she was just a kid. Wrong place, wrong time. And they made sure no one would ever hear her story." Shaq's jaw clenched. "They're not burying this. Not this time." Samuel hesitated, the weight of fear etched into his features. "You don't understand, Shaq. They've got reach, money, power, connections that don't show up in public records. If we go up against them," Shaq's voice cut through the tension, "then we make it public. Not through back channels or lawyers who'll settle quietly. We tell the truth. We show the world what they did. They may have power, but we've got the one thing they can't buy. Eyes willing to see the truth and voices willing to speak it." For a moment silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken risk. Then Samuel gave a slow nod, the weight of years of silence cracking at the edges. Shaq gathered the folder, his resolve hardening like steel. This wasn't just a personal mission anymore, it was a reckoning. Collier's empire had been built on broken promises and buried secrets, and it was time someone ripped away the facade. As he stepped outside into the sunlight, the folder clutched tightly in his grasp. Shaq knew the fight ahead would be more than just legal. It would be a battle for truth, for justice, and for redemption. Not just for Samuel and Alana, but for himself. But even as he resolved to take action, the world around him began to shift. Whispers turned into phone calls. At first they were cautious, an anonymous voice murmuring from a blocked number, suggesting Shaq might want to reconsider digging into Collier's affairs. He dismissed the call, assuming it was the typical corporate bluster. But the next one was sharper, laced with menace, warning him to stay away from matters beyond his control. At a board meeting later that week, the shift became undeniable. His own executives, faces familiar from years of shared successes and calculated risks, began to subtly distance themselves. Subtle comments were dropped like breadcrumbs. "We've all made decisions we'd rather not scrutinize," one murmured. "You're not considering stirring up old controversies, are you?" another prodded. Shaq's jaw tightened. These were men and women he had trusted, whose advice had once seemed like gospel. Now their voices twisted into veiled threats. The cost of standing up to Collier wasn't just professional, it was personal. They hinted at financial retaliation, lawsuits, even whispers about Shaq's own past deals that could be spun into scandals if he pushed too hard. The weight of their implications settled heavily on his chest. His empire, built over decades of hustle and grit, suddenly felt fragile, as though one wrong move could send the whole structure crumbling. Yet amidst the gathering storm, his thoughts turned back to Samuel's exhausted face, to Alana's quiet dignity as she navigated a world she could no longer see. They had become more than collateral in a corporate chess game. They were the embodiment of every silent victim Shaq had once chosen not to see. He couldn't sleep that night. The darkness pressed against the glass windows of his penthouse, and the city's pulse thrummed below, unaware of the battle being waged above. He sat in his study, the folder of documents spread before him, his hands trembling as he realized the full scope of what Collier's network had done. These weren't isolated acts of greed. They were calculated decisions, built on a foundation of silence, fear, and complicity. And Shaq's own name, Henderson Holdings, was entwined in the paperwork like a stain he couldn't scrub away. At dawn, as the first light painted the sky in muted tones of pink and gold, Shaq found himself at the edge of the construction site again. Samuel was there, his shoulders hunched as he methodically stacked materials. The man's quiet resilience struck Shaq like a blow. Here was someone who had every reason to disappear, to fade into obscurity, yet he showed up each day, carrying the weight of guilt and fear with a stoicism that shamed the giants of business. Shaq approached, his voice low but steady. "They're trying to scare me off," he said, his words more a confession than a warning. Samuel's eyes met his, tired yet unwavering. They always do, until someone refuses to be scared. Shaq inhaled sharply, the simple truth of those words settling deep into his bones. It wasn't just about him or his legacy anymore. It was about breaking the cycle of silence that allowed men like Collier to operate unchecked. But as much as he wanted to believe courage was enough, the reality was grimmer. His phone buzzed. Another message, this time from an unknown number. A video file. He hesitated before opening it, his gut twisting into knots. The footage was grainy, but unmistakable. A clip of Alana being guided through a narrow alley by Samuel, the camera lingering on her vulnerable form, a voice whispering threats beneath the static. The message was clear: back down, or the targets would no longer be collateral. They'd become intentional. Shaq's pulse roared in his ears, his hands clenched into fists, not in rage, but in raw determination. They had crossed a line. This was no longer about business, or even justice. It was about protecting the innocent from those who believed power granted them impunity. But how? Collier's reach extended deep into the city's infrastructure, into media channels, legal systems, and backroom deals. A frontal attack would be suicide. He paced the site, thoughts racing. Then, a glimmer of an idea formed, a way to flip the script, to use Collier's own arrogance against him. The key wasn't to confront Collier directly, but to gather undeniable evidence that couldn't be buried or spun. The hidden files were a start, but they needed more testimonies, witnesses, a paper trail that painted a picture too damning to ignore. And he'd need allies, those within the system who still had integrity, or at least a grudging respect for the truth. The path ahead was treacherous, but Shaq's resolve crystallized. He wasn't the naive entrepreneur he'd once been, nor the ruthless tycoon others believed. He was a man faced with a choice between silent complicity and courageous defiance. And he was done being silent. As the morning sun bathed the city in golden light, Shaq stood at the edge of the site, phone in hand. He sent a single text to a trusted journalist, whose integrity he trusted more than any boardroom promise. "Meet me. There's a story you need to hear, and evidence to prove it." He glanced once more at Samuel, who stood watching, the unspoken bond between them solidifying. They were both men who had been used, silenced, and threatened, but together they might just shatter the wall of corruption that loomed over them. The anonymous tip he'd received had been cryptic but precise, directing him to a crumbling, long-abandoned warehouse. It was the kind of place where stories were buried, where the walls whispered secrets, and Shaq felt the weight of every step as he made his way inside. Dust hung in the air like forgotten memories, and in a far corner beneath a broken workbench, he found a small battered metal box. Inside was a cassette tape, its label faded but a name still legible: Lila. His breath caught as he slid the tape into an old portable player, its wheels creaking with age. He pressed play and a voice, soft, trembling, unmistakably a woman's, filled the silence. Lila's voice, Samuel's late wife. She spoke in hurried, fragmented sentences, her words weaving a story that sent chills down Shaq's spine. She spoke of late-night meetings where bribes exchanged hands, of safety violations ignored, of warnings that had been dismissed with a callous laugh. She named names: executives, inspectors, lawyers, all complicit in a web of deceit orchestrated by Richard Collier. Lila's voice cracked as she recounted the events leading up to the warehouse collapse. The faulty steel beams, the ignored safety protocols, the desperate attempts to raise alarms that were silenced with threats and hush money. Her final words were almost a whisper, filled with fear and resignation. If anyone hears this, please, don't let them erase us. Shaq's grip tightened on the player, his knuckles whitening. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about Samuel and Alana. Lila had tried to blow the whistle, and she'd paid for it with her life. The story Samuel had kept locked inside wasn't one of a single misstep, but a calculated campaign to obliterate his family's credibility and safety. They hadn't just ignored Lila. They'd destroyed her, and Samuel, left to pick up the pieces, had been forced into silence, living under the shadow of Collier's corruption, while shielding his daughter from the same fate. As the tape ended, the silence was deafening. Shaq sat there, the weight of the recording sinking into him like a stone. He thought of Samuel's worn, stoic face, the hollow look in his eyes when he'd mentioned Alana's accident, and the careful way he moved around the site, as if constantly waiting for the next blow to fall. This was the missing piece. Lila's voice was more than a confession. It was a weapon, evidence that couldn't be twisted or dismissed, a story that demanded to be heard. But Shaq knew Collier wouldn't take this lightly. This tape had survived against all odds, and if he exposed it, Collier would come after him with everything he had. His company, his reputation, his personal safety, all of it would be in the crosshairs. And yet the thought of doing nothing, of letting Lila's final plea go unheard, was unbearable. Shaq felt the familiar pull of responsibility, the weight of power balanced against morality. This wasn't just business, it was a reckoning. He left the warehouse as night descended, the city's neon glow flickering in the distance. His phone buzzed with calls he ignored, lawyers, board members, reporters fishing for statements. He didn't answer. Instead, he drove through the empty streets until he reached Samuel's modest apartment, a small walk-up in a neighborhood Collier's developments hadn't yet reached. He climbed the stairs and knocked. When Samuel opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to wariness as he saw the tape in Shaq's hand. "I found this," Shaq said quietly. "It's Lila's voice." Samuel's face paled, his body sagging against the doorframe as though the weight of years collapsed on him, all at once. His hand trembled as he reached for the tape, but Shaq gently held it back. "She was trying to protect you and Alana," Shaq said, his voice low but urgent. "She wanted the truth to come out. You've carried this burden alone for too long." Samuel's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, his voice a raw whisper. "They told me it was safer to stay quiet. For Alana's sake. For mine. They said no one would believe me." Shaq stepped closer, his voice firm. "They were wrong. I believe you. And now we've got proof." For the first time, a spark of something like hope flickered across Samuel's face, but it was quickly eclipsed by fear. "If we use that tape, Collier will come for us. He'll crush everything." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Then we'll make sure he can't. We'll use the one thing he can't control, the truth, and the people who are ready to hear it." They sat in Samuel's small, dimly lit living room, the cassette player perched on the coffee table. Together they listened to Lila's voice again, each word weaving a tapestry of corruption and courage. And in that fragile, shared silence, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They weren't just victims of Collier's greed. They were survivors, bound by a truth too powerful to be buried. As dawn crept over the city, casting long shadows across Samuel's modest apartment, Shaq's mind raced with the possibilities. He would need allies, the right voices to amplify the story, and a plan to protect Samuel and Alana. But one thing was certain, the silence was over. The fight was no longer just his, or Samuel's. It was for everyone. Collier had silenced, for every voice he'd tried to erase. Shaq rose from the couch, determination etching lines of resolve across his face. "This changes everything," he said quietly, meeting Samuel's gaze. "We're not just fighting for Alana anymore. We're fighting for every family Collier's empire has crushed. And we're going to win." Cameras flanked every angle. News vans lined the perimeter, and a makeshift podium had been hastily erected with banners touting innovation and progress under the bold logo of Collier Industries. The narrative had been set. This was a press event meant to showcase Collier's latest development, and Shaq's presence was intended as an endorsement, a symbol of continuity and power. But beneath the polished surface, a different story was poised to unfold. Shaq's team, composed of trusted aides and tech-savvy operatives, had spent days planning this moment. They'd infiltrated the construction site with hidden cameras, capturing unsafe scaffolding, falsified permits tucked into back offices, and workers forced to cut corners under whispered threats. They had planted evidence where Collier's own hubris would ensure it was overlooked. waiting for the perfect moment to pull back the curtain. Today wasn't just about exposing negligence. It was about revealing the depths of a corporate empire that had traded safety for profit, humanity for control. As the event began, reporters clamored for Shaq's attention. He stood at the podium, his towering figure commanding respect, his voice steady but laced with an undertone of resolve. "It's an honor to be here today," he said, the words rolling smoothly, almost too smoothly. "Collier's vision for this city is ambitious, and I'm proud to stand with him as we look to the future." His eyes scanned the crowd, locking briefly with Samuel's from a distance. Samuel stood beside Alana, who clutched his hand tightly, her expression a mix of confusion and quiet fear. Shaq continued his speech, weaving platitudes about growth and opportunity, until a subtle hand signal from his aide at the edge of the stage triggered the shift. The live feed, broadcast to millions via social media and network news outlets, flickered. The screen behind Shaq, which had displayed Collier's sanitized promotional video, abruptly cut to grainy footage of workers in perilous positions, of shortcuts that endangered lives, and of neglected safety measures that had already caused injury and death. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the reality of Collier's empire was laid bare. Then came the true blow. The footage cut to Lila's recording. Her voice trembled with urgency and fear, as she recounted the systemic failures, the bribes, the threats, and the final collapse that had cost her life and Alana's sight. The camera panned to Samuel standing rigid beside his daughter, his face ashen but resolute. The world watched as the story he had kept buried for years spilled out, unfiltered and undeniable. Shaq's face remained composed, though his pulse thundered in his ears. The risk was monumental. His own name, Henderson Holdings, was tied to the permits and signatures that now glared from the screen. He knew the blowback would be swift, both from Collier's camp and his own board, but he refused to flinch. The truth was bigger than his reputation. As the cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of shock and dawning understanding on the audience's faces, Shaq spoke, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "This isn't just negligence. This is a system that sacrifices lives for profit. I can't stand behind that, and I won't." Reporters surged forward, their questions a cacophony of confusion and outrage. Shaq's security detail braced, but he raised a hand to steady them. He gestured toward the screen. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said, his tone measured but fierce. "These are not isolated incidents. They are patterns of abuse, and the voices that tried to speak up, like Lila's, were silenced by greed and fear. No more." In the crowd, Alana squeezed her father's hand, her lips forming words no one else could hear. Samuel knelt to meet her level, his expression softening as she whispered. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his guilt lighten, as though his late wife's spirit was watching over them, her voice finally heard by the world she had tried to protect. Back on stage, Shaq acknowledged the inevitable consequences. His team had already begun preparing for the fallout. The phone calls from irate investors, the board's emergency meetings, the media firestorm. But as the live broadcast surged across the internet, hashtags trending within minutes, he felt a sense of clarity. The cost of silence had been too high for too long. The backlash against his pristine image was a small price to pay for justice. And as he watched the reactions unfold on the surrounding screens, he saw not just outrage, but solidarity calls for investigations, demands for reform, voices that echoed Lila's final plea. The broadcast ended with a final image, Alana's small hand clutching Samuel's, her face lifted toward the sky, a fragile but unbreakable symbol of resilience. The cameras cut out, the screens went dark, and the murmurs of the crowd swelled into an uproar. Some shouted questions at Shaq, others turned away in disbelief or anger. But the truth was out, and there was no putting it back into the shadows. Shaq stepped down from the podium, his steps deliberate, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and steely resolve. He met Samuel and Alana, at the edge of the crowd, his voice low. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," he warned. "But we're not backing down." Samuel nodded, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. "We've been scared long enough." As they turned to leave, Alana's voice, soft but clear, carried through the air. "Thank you, Mr. Shaq," she said, her words fragile, yet powerful. The weight of them settled over him like a mantle, a quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't just about retribution, it was about redemption. And for the first time in years, as Shaq walked away from the cameras and the clamor, he felt something shift deep inside. The fight was far from over, but at least now, The silence had been broken. The aftershocks of the broadcast reverberated through the city's core like a tremor long overdue. Collier's legal team wasted no time launching a counteroffensive, their statements dripping with precision-crafted venom. They painted Samuel as a disgruntled worker harboring a personal vendetta, accusing him of falsifying documents and conspiring with Shaq to tarnish a respected businessman's reputation. Press releases spun a web of distraction, diverting attention from the damning evidence and flooding the media with a narrative of betrayal and corporate sabotage. The spin was ruthless, a storm of half-truths and outright fabrications designed to shift the public's gaze. Shaq's phone buzzed incessantly, each call a new demand, a new threat, or a sponsor wavering on the edge of withdrawal. His endorsements, meticulously built over decades, hung in the balance. Yet, for the first time, he didn't flinch. His usual calm was sharpened by a steely resolve, a determination that extended beyond brand preservation or financial gain. This was about integrity, about standing firm in the face of calculated smear tactics. He met each call with a quiet, measured response. If they're with us, they'll stay. If not, we'll rebuild. Samuel, meanwhile, faced a barrage of attention he had never sought. Reporters camped outside his modest apartment, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him, as he tried to escort Alana to her appointments. The weight of years spent in silence and shadows pressed heavily on him. But he found strength in the unwavering support from Shaq and a growing network of community allies who refused to buy into Collier's spin. He stood taller now, his voice firmer in interviews, his eyes no longer avoiding the camera. "I have nothing to hide," he told a reporter who pressed for comment. "The truth speaks for itself." Alana, however, felt the strain most acutely. The newfound attention and the whispers in public spaces, some supportive, others cruel, took a toll on her fragile health. Her asthma, controlled for years, flared under the stress. Samuel found himself torn between defending the truth and shielding his daughter from a world suddenly too bright, too loud, too cruel. It was during one of these episodes, as Alana struggled to breathe, that Shaq stepped in without hesitation. He arranged for immediate medical care, sparing no expense, and stayed by Samuel's side as doctors stabilized her condition. In those quiet moments by the hospital bed, the gravity of their fight settled over Shaq like a weight he had never anticipated. This wasn't just a public relations battle, or a corporate reckoning. This was about a little girl who had already lost too much, about a father who had been silenced by a system designed to crush dissent, and about a truth that had to be protected at any cost. Shaq's resolve deepened. "We're not letting them do this to her," he told Samuel, his voice low but steady. "Not again." As the storm intensified, Shaq's own reputation took hit after hit. Longtime sponsors issued statements distancing themselves, citing unverified claims and pending investigations. His team fielded a constant stream of inquiries from media outlets, board members and attorneys warning of financial ruin. Yet, amid the swirling chaos, Shaq's stance never wavered. Instead, he reached out to old contacts, journalists he trusted, activists who had long fought against corporate corruption, and even a few retired regulators who knew where the bodies were buried. Quietly, they formed a coalition determined to keep the pressure on Collier's network, refusing to let the truth be buried under legal maneuvering and media spin. The strategy was simple yet risky. Leaks of new evidence began surfacing, emails that hinted at deeper cover-ups, financial records exposing hidden payoffs, and testimonies from other workers too afraid to speak up until now. Each revelation tightened the noose around Collier's empire, yet it also painted a target on Shaq's back. The smear campaigns intensified, with tabloids running lurid headlines questioning his motives, his integrity, even his sanity. Anonymous sources whispered of personal scandals, old grudges, anything to discredit the man who had dared to challenge a titan. Samuel, witnessing the lengths to which Collier's machine would go, felt a surge of guilt. "I didn't mean to drag you into this," he told Shaq quietly one evening, as they watched Alana sleep. "You didn't have to do this." Shaq's response was simple, yet it carried the weight of conviction. "I couldn't not do it," he said. "Some things are bigger than all of us." The backlash crescendoed when an emergency injunction was filed to halt the investigation, a move designed to buy Collier's legal team time to regroup. Shaq's coalition countered immediately, filing appeals and releasing carefully curated evidence that reignited public outrage. Online forums, once flooded with Collier's narrative, shifted. Hashtags in support of Samuel and Alana trended across social media. Community leaders, clergy, and even a few unexpected allies in politics began to speak out, calling for accountability and justice. As the tide slowly turned, Samuel found a quiet strength in the support of strangers and the unwavering presence of Shaq by his side. The storm was far from over, but cracks were forming in the carefully constructed facade Collier had built over years of dominance and intimidation. In those moments, amidst the chaos of backlash and uncertainty, Samuel realized that he was no longer just a victim trying to survive. He was part of something bigger, a fight for truth, for dignity, for his daughter's future. And as Shaq watched the world respond, his voice cutting through the noise with quiet determination, he knew that no amount of sponsorship or reputation could replace the unshakable belief that he had done the right thing. The storm would pass, but the truth, once exposed, could never be silenced. Shaq arrived flanked by a few trusted allies, his face unreadable but his stride purposeful. The marble hallways, usually echoing with the shuffle of legal formalities, buzzed with the hushed anticipation of a battle years in the making. Inside, Collier's legal team perched at their polished table, a wall of expensive suits and carefully curated arrogance. They spun their narrative with surgical precision, portraying Samuel as an unstable employee, a man nursing old grudges, whose daughter's blindness was, they claimed, nothing more than a tragic accident. They pointed to inconsistencies in witness statements, leaned heavily on half-truths, and cloaked the company's negligence in legal jargon. Their arguments were delivered with practiced smoothness, their intent clear: discredit Samuel, discredit the evidence, and control the story. Samuel sat stoically beside his counsel, his posture rigid, but his eyes steady. Alana, too young to understand the nuances, but old enough to sense the stakes, sat silently beside him, her small hand gripping his. Every twist of Collier's narrative felt like a fresh assault, a deliberate attempt to erase her suffering, her truth. The courtroom's atmosphere thickened with each deceptive claim, the air heavy with a tension that bordered on suffocating. But then Shaq rose, his massive frame a stark contrast to the polished attorney's. His voice, usually warm and commanding, was low and deliberate. He introduced a private ledger, a slim, nondescript binder, but the weight it carried was enough to make the air crackle. The contents were clear, unassailable, evidence of Collier's illicit payments to city officials, forged safety reports, and falsified inspection records. Each document was a nail driven into the coffin of Collier's empire. The courtroom murmured, the whispers growing louder as the implications settled over the room. Collier's attorneys scrambled, their rehearsed arguments faltering under the weight of undeniable proof. The presiding judge's sharp gaze pinned them, and though Collier himself maintained a mask of calm, a flicker of panic betrayed him. The fortress he had built, brick by deceptive brick, was crumbling in real time. Shaq's words, measured and precise, painted a picture not just of corporate corruption, but of human cost, of a child's sight stolen, of a father's dignity stripped, of a system that had prioritized profit over safety. He didn't grandstand or shout. His voice resonated with a quiet authority, the kind that demanded attention not through volume, but through undeniable truth. The ledger's revelations were damning, but it was Shaq's framing linking the cold numbers to the warm, real faces in the courtroom that sealed the impact. As the tide shifted, Samuel's defense attorney, emboldened by the turn, stepped forward. With newfound confidence, she dismantled the remaining fragments of Collier's defense, piece by piece. Witnesses, once hesitant, found their voices. Former employees, inspired by Shaq's bravery and Samuel's steadfastness, provided testimonies that confirmed years of cover-ups and deceit. The narrative Collier's team had spun unraveled with alarming speed, the threads tugged loose by truth long suppressed. The public, who had filled the courtroom's gallery and spilled out into the streets beyond, reacted viscerally. Social media platforms exploded with updates and commentary, the hashtag Justice for Alana trending globally within minutes. News outlets, some of which had previously echoed Collier's polished statements, pivoted sharply as the weight of evidence and public sentiment became undeniable. For the first time, Samuel wasn't just a faceless whistleblower. He was a father fighting not just for his daughter, but for accountability and justice. Collier, his mask slipping, attempted a last-minute statement, an apology laced with legal caveats, and veiled attempts to salvage his reputation. But it rang hollow, a desperate echo in a room no longer willing to be swayed by platitudes and power play. The judge's gavel brought the courtroom to silence, her decision clear and resonant. Collier was to face, not just of fraud, but of reckless endangerment. his empire dismantled piece by piece. The civil suit in Samuel's favor was a victory not just for one man, but for a truth long buried under greed and silence. Outside the courtroom, the air was electric with a mix of celebration and solemn acknowledgement. Samuel emerged with Alana by his side, his shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of secrecy. The cameras that once sought to paint him as unstable now framed him as a symbol of resilience. Alana, her hand tucked into her father's, smiled faintly despite the lingering shadows of the ordeal. For the first time in years, they could breathe. Shaq, standing at a respectful distance, met Samuel's gaze. No words were exchanged, but in that shared look was an acknowledgement deeper than any spoken vow. A bond forged not by blood, but by a shared refusal to let injustice prevail. The courtroom doors closed behind them, but the story was far from over. The impact of the showdown rippled outward, a call for accountability that would echo far beyond the walls of that chamber. In the end, the truth had shattered the silence, the lies and the power that had once seemed insurmountable. Samuel's quiet courage, Shaq's unwavering stand, and the undeniable evidence of Collier's corruption had converged into a force that could not be silenced. The storm had broken, but from its wreckage emerged something stronger than scandal or scandal's fleeting headlines, a testament to resilience, integrity, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his child. High-rise towers that bore his name were hastily rebranded or abandoned altogether, their hollowed-out shells standing as monuments to a man brought down by his own arrogance. But beyond the headlines and soundbites, the real story, the one of human resilience and the quiet, steadfast fight for justice, played out far from the spotlight. Samuel's return to the construction world wasn't marked by celebration or applause. He resumed his role, this time not as a silent figure on the periphery, but as a lead engineer whose expertise was finally acknowledged. There were no grand speeches or public declarations, just the quiet respect of those who recognized the man behind the blueprints. His once shadowed presence on site now drew nods of genuine acknowledgement from workers and supervisors alike. A silent agreement that he had not only survived but earned his place through unwavering integrity. Shaq, meanwhile, found his own world shifting. His endorsements wavered, some sponsors distancing themselves from the controversy, but his public image transformed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He became a symbol not of sports or celebrity, but of principle. Interviews painted him as a man willing to stake his reputation to stand with those who had no voice. His fortune remained intact, but more importantly, his credibility soared. He received invitations to speak on panels about ethics in business, leadership under fire, and the responsibility of those in power to advocate for the voiceless. Yet Shaq remained characteristically grounded, shrugging off accolades with a wry smile and a soft-spoken deflection of attention. Alana's journey became its own quiet revolution. What was once dismissed as irreversible damage from the accident that had blinded her was now a sliver of hope, thanks to Shaq's behind-the-scenes funding of a cutting-edge treatment. While the path to recovery was neither immediate nor guaranteed, for the first time since the accident, Alana's world flickered with possibility. Doctors whispered about a chance, however slim, that her vision could partially return, a prospect that infused her family's once muted days with cautious optimism. Samuel, ever the realist, tempered his expectations but couldn't help but feel a guarded hope igniting in his chest, a hope he hadn't dared nurture before. The media, ever hungry for a fresh narrative, eventually shifted focus to new scandals and emerging stories. But the bond forged between Samuel and Shaq didn't fade with the fading headlines. Their relationship deepened, not with public gestures but through quiet personal interactions. Dinners shared without cameras, conversations about family, faith, and the shared weight of their past decisions. Shaq visited Alana's therapy sessions, not as a benefactor but as a friend, sitting quietly in the corner while she navigated her new routines. Samuel, once wary of Shaq's intentions, grew to trust him as a brother, someone who hadn't just used his influence for show but had stood firm when it mattered most. Behind the scenes, the impact of their choices rippled outward. Samuel's reinstatement wasn't just a personal victory, it set a precedent. Other whistleblowers, emboldened by his example, stepped forward in their own fields, calling out unsafe practices and systemic injustices. Regulatory bodies, once comfortably in the pockets of tycoons like Collier, faced scrutiny they had long evaded. Samuel's story became a quiet rallying cry within the construction industry and beyond, a reminder that integrity wasn't just a moral ideal, but a tangible force capable of dismantling corruption. Shaq's influence, though slightly bruised, evolved. He declined offers to capitalize on his role in the case, turning down book deals and documentary pitches that sought to sensationalize the story. Instead, he channeled his energy into quietly funding scholarships for engineering students from underrepresented communities, establishing programs to support whistleblowers, and backing organizations committed to ethical leadership. His actions spoke louder than any endorsement deal ever could. In the end, the headlines faded, but the relationships remained. Alana's laughter, once a rarity, now filled Samuel's modest home with a warmth that no amount of money could manufacture. She traced shapes with her fingers, learning Braille with a determination that made her father's chest ache with pride. And when the light filtering through her window caught her face just right, Samuel sometimes thought he saw the faintest flicker of recognition in her gaze, a fleeting glimpse of a future still unwritten. Shaq, visiting one quiet afternoon, stood at the doorway of their home, watching father and daughter with a soft smile. He said little, his presence alone a testament to the journey they'd all endured. When Samuel finally stood and offered his hand, it wasn't the handshake of a business associate or a celebrity gesture. It was the clasp of two men who had faced the weight of silence, fear, and societal barriers, and chosen time and again to confront them together. The victory wasn't in the public dismantling of Collier's empire, though that had been a necessary reckoning. It was in the quiet resilience of Samuel's return to the field, in Alana's emerging hope, and in the unspoken bond that bound Shaq and Samuel beyond race, beyond status, beyond fear. They had stepped into the storm, not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. As Shaq left that evening, he glanced back once, his gaze meeting Samuel's. In that moment, there was no need for words. The journey they had shared wasn't about headlines or vindication. It was about the ties that bind, the invisible threads of humanity, courage, and truth that no power, however corrupt, could ever sever. Shaq stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, his broad frame clad in a tailored suit, the tension of past battles now softened into quiet reflection. Next to him, Samuel adjusted the collar of his crisp shirt, a man no longer burdened by shadows, while Alana, her delicate frame wrapped in a pale lavender dress, clutched his hand with a mixture of pride and nervousness. The crowd murmured with anticipation as a local official stepped up to the podium, the backdrop of the foundation's modern architecture, a striking contrast to the traditional speeches. Shaq's mind, however, drifted not to the ceremony unfolding before him, but to the journey that had led them here. He remembered the first time he'd seen Samuel feeding Alana on the construction site, an ordinary moment that had unveiled a story more complex than any headline could capture. The memory of that quiet act of love, set against the jeers and indifference of others, remained as vivid now as it had been then. As the official spoke of community spirit and resilience, Shaq caught sight of Samuel's profile, strong, steady, yet softened by the weight of past fears now lifted. Alana's face tilted upward, her once clouded eyes now partially sighted thanks to the groundbreaking treatment, quietly funded by Shaq's network. She traced the edges of her father's hand with delicate fingers, her lips curving into a shy but confident smile. It was a sight that stirred something deep within Shaq, a reminder of why he had chosen to stand in the storm alongside them. The ceremony continued, cameras flashing, capturing moments for history, the unveiling of the commemorative plaque etched with Lila's name, the speeches of survivors who had found courage in the story of Samuel's fight, the pledges from local leaders to uphold the Foundation's mission of justice and inclusion. Yet amidst the formalities, Shaq felt an undercurrent of genuine connection, a thread running through every person present. This wasn't just a public relations moment, it was a reckoning with the truth, and a celebration of those who had dared to voice it. When the applause faded, Shaq stepped forward, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "This foundation isn't just about bricks and glass," he said, his tone steady but resonant with emotion. "It's about honoring the courage it takes to speak out, to stand tall when the world tells you to stay silent." Samuel didn't just fight for his daughter, he fought for every family who's been told their truth didn't matter. And Alana, she's shown us all what resilience looks like. This building, these programs, they're just the beginning. He gestured to Samuel and Alana, who joined him under the weight of hundreds of gazes. Samuel's hand rested protectively on Alana's shoulder, while she leaned into the embrace, her once uncertain posture now confident. "Thank you," Alana whispered, her voice clear enough to catch in the nearby microphones. The simplicity of her words carried a weight no speech could match, a profound acknowledgement of the journey they had shared and the future they were building. Shaq's gaze swept the crowd, catching the eyes of those who had stood with them, the whistleblowers, the silent supporters, the families who had found hope in their story, each face etched with its own history, reflected the quiet truth that change didn't come from a single act of defiance or a headline-grabbing exposé. It came from the relentless, everyday courage of people like Samuel and Ilana, who had risked everything to make their voices heard. The celebration shifted as attendees moved toward the reception area, the air filled with laughter and quiet conversations. Children played in the newly landscaped gardens, their carefree energy a sharp contrast to the weighty struggles that had once loomed over this community. Inside, walls displayed stories of other whistleblowers, tributes to those who had fought and those who continued to fight. Samuel's story, now framed in photographs and testimonials, stood as a testament to the enduring power of truth. As the evening light softened into twilight, Shaq found himself standing alone for a moment, away from the crowd. He watched Ilana laughing with a group of children, her laughter ringing out like a bell in the crisp air. Samuel approached quietly, his steps deliberate, his expression reflective but content. "Never thought I'd see this day," Samuel murmured, his voice low enough to blend with the breeze. "I spent so long looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next hit, but today it feels like we've turned a corner." Shaq nodded, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "It's more than a corner, Samuel. It's a whole new path, one you carved with your courage." He glanced toward Ilana, then back at Samuel. "You did that." Samuel's lips twitched into a rare, genuine smile. "Not alone," he said quietly. "Couldn't have done it without you." Their conversation lingered in the air, a silent acknowledgement of battles fought not for personal glory, but for something far greater. They stood in the fading light, two men from vastly different worlds, bound by a shared commitment to truth and justice. Their bond was forged not in boardrooms or backroom deals, but in the quiet acts of resilience, the whispered truths brought into the open, and the unwavering decision to stand tall when it mattered most. As the crowd began to disperse, Ilana joined them, slipping her small hand into her father's and reaching out with her free hand to grasp Shaq's. "Can we come back tomorrow?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. Shaq's heart clenched, and he crouched to meet her gaze. "Anytime you want, kiddo," he said with a soft smile. "This place is as much yours as it is anyone's." The three of them stood together as the last rays of sun bathed the foundation in warm, golden light. The legacy of what they had built wasn't measured in headlines or awards, but in the quiet resilience of a father's love, a child's unbreakable spirit, and a man's unwavering commitment to truth. And as the evening settled around them, it was clear that this was not an ending, but a beginning. A legacy etched not just in stone, but in the hearts of everyone it touched. There's more to this story than what meets the eye. If you believe that truth should never be silenced, if you know that courage and connection can topple the strongest walls, then you're right where you need to be. Stay tuned as we peel back the layers, one twist at a time. This journey isn't over, it's just getting started.